This evening. I'm Seth Morris. I'm the Voter Protection Director for the North Carolina Democratic Party, and I'm going to share my screen with you. Hold on just one second. So I am just going to speak with you all tonight about voter protection in North Carolina. If you have any questions, please just toss them over into the chat box, and I will see them there, and I'll probably wait until the end to go through all the questions and answer them. But you know, if you want to add your questions in the chat box, I'm glad to take them there. So here's my agenda for the evening. First, I just want to go through the national voter protection context, sort of the universe that I work in. Talk a little bit about why voter protection matters, and specifically here in North Carolina. Then I'm going to tell you all about the Democratic Party's voter protection program in the state and the work that we are doing. Of course, planning for an election and the COVID-19 pandemic and how the state has responded to that. And as we were mentioning in the introductions, part of that response was the passage of House Bill 1169 last week. So I'll talk a little bit about what that bill does to make voting easier this fall. And then I'll just go through some of the common voting problems that I deal with and that my volunteers deal with, and things to be on the lookout for as we sort of head into this election. And then, of course, I'm going to be very glad to take any questions that you may have related to voting and voting rights. So to begin, sort of the story of modern voter protection begins with a court decision in 1982. There was a consent decree between the DNC and the RNC that prohibited the RNC from participating in any voter suppression efforts, sort of in the name of voter fraud. And that was largely targeted towards activity at the polling place. So specifically in the 1980 presidential election, the RNC and their affiliate committees posted armed guards outside of voting sites in heavily African-American neighborhoods in cities like Philadelphia and across the country. The DNC sued, and there was a consent decree, and that consent decree was in effect until 2018, or actually until 2017. And after over 30 years, that consent decree was, a new judge came along, who was actually, unfortunately, an Obama appointee, who saw no need to continue that consent decree and ended it. And that really freed up the Republican Party to engage in a lot of voter suppression efforts. And so they plan to appoint a lot of poll observers across the country. No doubt they will be engaging in sort of efforts to root out voter fraud, so they say, by trying to intimidate people from voting. And this is the first presidential election that we've had in a really long time where they can engage in that kind of activity. And of course, they plan to do that. The Trump campaign has a team full of folks. They have someone who's their election day operations director nationally, and they'll be hiring election day operations directors in all of the battleground states, including North Carolina. I'm not sure if they have hired someone yet. I've been trying to find out that information, but I know that they will have someone who is essentially my evil twin, who is on the other side of the coin, trying to make it harder for people to vote in North Carolina this fall. And they're spending a lot of money on that. And in response to the loss of the consent decree, and in response to what we saw happen in 2018, specifically in Georgia with Stacey Abrams, the Democratic Party is also making historic investments in voter protection and protecting voting rights. So that includes a lot of litigation to challenge laws across the country that are deleterious to voters. And also to hire voter protection directors like me and my deputy and our organizer. And our goal is to hopefully add some regional staff in regions across the state to prepare for the election, to organize volunteers, and to have an eye and an ear to the ground to see what's going on in all of our key Democratic precincts. Unfortunately, all of that was bad enough. And then we saw COVID-19 come along, and the Republicans, as we have seen in Wisconsin and now in South Carolina and Georgia, have seemed to want to use the pandemic to their advantage. In Wisconsin, they tried to have tens of thousands of absentee ballots tossed out. There was a fight about whether the election would even be held when it was. The Democratic governor tried to postpone it to the summer so that they could prepare to have voting in a safe manner. The Republicans sued, and ultimately they did hold it on the originally scheduled date. And, you know, Democrats fought that all the way, including the voter protection team there in Wisconsin. And then my counterparts in Georgia were engaged very heavily in keeping people in line and gathering the kinds of stories that they're going to gather and probably are going to litigate in Georgia and South Carolina based on the problems that we saw last week. And then, of course, if Republicans are doing something terribly nationally, there's always going to be a Republican in North Carolina who's engaged in the same behavior. And Senate Leader Phil Berger, this was now back in April, you know, sort of poisoned the well already, and they're sort of starting to lay the seeds of their plan to cry voter fraud when they lose in the fall. Said that he didn't trust Roy Cooper and the Democratic majority Board of Elections to run the election in a seemly manner. And then your own senator, Natasha Marcus, countered, and you can see the quote there, but she has been on the forefront of this fight in the General Assembly to push for pro-voter changes to the law and to try to make voter administration easier this year. So, you know, why does voter protection matter? Why does what we do, litigating and organizing and educating folks, matter? And the first reason it matters that is partisan is that Democrats win when we expand the electorate. And Republicans across the country, but particularly here in North Carolina, have tried to make it harder for people of color, for the poor, for students, for the elderly to vote. So much so that one federal judge said that they tried to enact racist election laws with surgical precision. And Democrats have litigated that in state court and in federal court. We have litigated gerrymandering, we have litigated election laws, we have litigated voter ID, and that is the real work of voter protection that I do, and that really helps shape the electorate in a positive way and ensures that people can vote who want to vote. And then also we combat misinformation. We try to stop voter intimidation. We have a hotline that any voter can call, and we will answer their questions about voting. And then we, on election day and the lead up to election day during early voting, have legal volunteers at the county level and at the statewide level who are trying to troubleshoot issues at the polls. And then, of course, we litigate when we have to. The Democratic Party is currently engaged in a few different lawsuits, particularly with regard to early voting and absentee voting, trying to make it easier for people to vote. And then this is just a piece of math from the 2016 election. There are 2,700 precincts, give or take, in North Carolina. In 2016, there were 2,706. There's been some consolidation since then, so there's now 2,600 some. And Roy Cooper only won the state by 10,277 votes, which, of course, there are heavily Democratic precincts and heavily Republican precincts and precincts in the middle, but on average, that means that in every precinct in the state, if 4 people who tended to vote Democrat were denied the right to vote for some reason, then Pat McCrory would still be our governor. We wouldn't have a veto with the legislature, we wouldn't have seen the leadership that we have seen over the past 4 years from Governor Cooper. So, you know, voter intimidation and the administrative mishaps and all of the things that can lead to someone not being able to vote happen on the margins, but those margins can really matter when we're talking about elections in a state that is so close like North Carolina, and that really illustrates that point. What does my program do? We do 3 different things. Myself and my deputy Jose and our organizer Othniel. The first thing we do is advocacy. So a big part of my job over the past 2 months has been trying to work with the legislature and the State Board of Elections to craft a pandemic response bill that made it easier for people to vote given the conditions on the ground. And then we help local Democrats with early voting plans. So that's a lot of talking to Board of Elections members, talking to Democratic Party chairs and precinct chairs and others, and trying to engage to make that early voting process as open and to have as many sites and as many hours as we can possibly have. The second thing we do is education. So we provide a lot of voting rights trainings and material. I do conversations like this with folks like you and other Democratic groups and community groups. And then we have our voter assistance hotline, and that's a number that is active right now. It's been active since before the March 3rd primary here. And any person can call that number to ask a question about voting or to report an issue that they have at the polls or report an issue that they may see out in their community. And that number is only as good as we can advertise it. And so, one of our big concerns is being able to ramp up the advertising of that number in digital ads and other formats so that people can know it and see it and know to call it if they have any questions. And all of the Democratic campaigns in the state will be sharing that number on their literature and on their get out the vote materials and on their mail. So, we have a great volunteer need to answer those calls, in the ramp up to Election Day in September and October and early November. And then the third thing we do is organizing. And that is largely the province of my deputy and my organizer, but they are recruiting volunteers right now to serve as poll observers, to assist with the voter assistance hotline, to be attorneys in our legal boiler room, or to be local counsel in any of the 100 counties in North Carolina, recruiting people to go observe the absentee vote approval or the absentee ballot approval process at local boards of elections, et cetera. So there's a lot of need for folks on the ground in a county or in a state of 100 counties and 10 million some people. We just, we need people to multiply our efforts everywhere. And so I get to that point by saying these are the things that you can do to help protect the vote in your community. One of the first things you can do is you can vote absentee, and you can request your ballot right now, and you can vote it as soon as you get it in September. And that will serve to help take some of the demand off of the local boards of elections. If you request it early and you return it early, they don't have a huge ramp up, a huge peak right before Election Day, where they're having to process the applications and accept the ballots, approve or disapprove the ballots. And that will be very helpful to the administrators and take a lot of pressure off of the system. And then, of course, we know that voting is going to take longer because of COVID-19, and we know there's going to be a lot of concerns around Election Day polling places and early voting. So to the extent that we're taking pressure off of that system, I think it's helpful for activists like us to think about voting at home. The second thing you can do is, of course, register voters in your neighborhood. We're rolling out a packet right now through the party. I'm working with our digital team to do this. Essentially a digital toolkit that you can do contactless drop-offs at your neighbors' houses with a voter registration forms, with an absentee request form, and with a sort of instruction sheet for folks who may not be registered or may not know how to request an absentee ballot to do that for themselves. And voter registration numbers have really taken a hit. In January of this year, we were at about 160% of where we were in the January of 2016. In April of this year, we were at about 40% of where we were in April of 2016, and that's all volunteer voter registration essentially shut down. And the DMV wasn't open, and the DMV is where the vast majority of people either register or update their registration. And so there's a lot of challenge around that because people aren't interacting with our volunteers or with the DMV. And so registering voters is going to be really important. Of course, helping your friends and neighbors request an absentee ballot, serving your community as a poll worker. The vast majority or the average age of poll workers in North Carolina is above 60. Of course, it's folks who are in the sort of danger zone for COVID, who are most vulnerable to COVID. And so a lot of folks who have historically been poll observers are stepping aside this year. We've seen this in a lot of the later primary states, and Unfortunately, in places like Wisconsin, right, when COVID was starting to hit, people were quitting the day of or not showing up or calling the night before and saying they weren't going to work at the polls. But we have a little bit of lead time right now. And so particularly younger folks, I'm encouraging to serve your community by signing up to be a poll worker if there is a need. Because, in a traditional election, we would be recruiting observers to be in those polling places with poll workers. We are still doing that, but this is the first election where we are also focusing towards, orienting people towards serving as poll workers, because we really need those folks to get everyone through in a timely manner. And then, of course, we need volunteers to answer our hotline and to serve as observers at the polls. And if you want to just stay informed locally and just be eyes and ears at the boards of elections and ask questions about how they're preparing for COVID and ask questions about how they're preparing for an onslaught of absentee ballots, that's really useful to be an advocate locally. And then, of course, this one's for you, Ian. You can contribute to NCDP and other voter protection organizations. We are still ushering financial resources for our program, and a lot of our partner organizations are too. So that's one way you can help if you don't want to get out and put man hours into the work of voter protection this year. So I want to talk a little bit about voting and COVID-19, the effect that it will have. Some of this is probably old information at this point, but these are the things that we started thinking about in the spring and working towards with the legislature over the past several weeks. The first thing is that it's just an enormous strain on the county boards of elections, in large part because local governments are having to cut their budgets, and a lot of boards of elections aren't getting the money they thought they were going to get, given that this is a presidential year. I think you're fortunate in Mecklenburg County to have a county commission who understands that there are going to be additional costs this year and are going to adopt a budget that reflects that. But in a lot of counties, every county in the state has a Democratic majority board of elections. A lot of counties have Republican county commissions that are willing to cut this budget first this cycle. And that's a real problem that we're seeing and we're fighting in a lot of places. Of course, they're going to need more staff and equipment to account for an increase in absentee ballots and ensuring that voting stations are sanitized and there's adequate distance and things at early voting sites and election day polling places. And then what I've already alluded to, that there are a lot of poll workers who are backing out who've previously done it. So there's an additional need for poll workers in many communities. We anticipate seeing a big increase in vote by mail, and this is a good thing in my estimation. I mean, everyone should vote in the way that they think is safest and best for them. And in the middle of a pandemic, that means for a lot of people voting by mail for the first time. In a typical election, only 3 to 5% of North Carolinians vote by mail. By one estimate of the State Board of Elections, that could be as much as 30 or 50% this year. And so that increases the burden on the county boards, and it just presents a new challenge for people who do field work and otherwise engage with voters. And voting by mail can be a little bit confusing. It used to be that you had to have 2 witnesses or a notary. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but HB 1169 made it such that you only have to have 1 witness this year. But you do have to request the ballot, and then wait for the ballot, vote the ballot, return it, and that sort of 2-step process can be foreign to people who haven't done it before. So there's a significant organizing and education effort that will have to happen there. And then this is something that, part of the problem in Georgia in particular was bad training around new equipment and new equipment being faulty. But another problem was that they consolidated polling places in many places because for whatever reason, some polling places were inadequate for social distancing, or essentially, a lot of private facilities that have been polling places in the past said, we don't want you to come into our facility right now. And so they consolidated a lot of voting sites, and then they had to do social distancing within those polling sites, and they sanitized voting stations, and all of that added up to longer lines at the polling places. And then, of course, there was an increased demand for curbside voting in many places because voters didn't feel comfortable going into the polling place. So, we anticipate seeing that, and counties need to be preparing to have staff who are, that can adequately deal with an increase in curbside voting, and they need to be thinking about if they consolidate polling places, ensuring that there's adequate equipment and adequate, letting voters know adequate information to voters about polling places being consolidated. So those are all challenges that we perceive with COVID. And then there has been a bipartisan effort that finally passed last week, thank God. It was signed by the governor, House Bill 1169, which sought to deal with at least some of these problems. And there were bills sponsored solely by Democrats in both the House and the Senate that were much, much better and much, much more comprehensive, including a bill sponsored by Senator Marcus in the Senate that was very, very good and thoughtful. And then there was this bipartisan bill that gets us about halfway there, but with a Republican General Assembly, of course, that was the best we could get. So the good things that the bill does is that it reduces the witness requirement for absentee ballots to a single witness. That will be incredibly helpful, particularly for older folks who may only have one caretaker and who don't feel comfortable leaving the house. But also for any voter who wants to vote an absentee ballot. I mean, for example, I live only with my fiance, and we will witness each other's ballots, and we don't have to leave the house to get someone to witness our ballot. It allows for the return of the absentee ballot request form by fax or email. That actually is a restoration of a previous statute that was taken away a couple years ago. But that will be helpful to folks who don't want to mail in their request form. But I think is one of the biggest things is that it requires the state board to create an online portal to allow people to request absentee ballots, and that this is an entirely new system. We've never had an online request form before, but this will be much easier than mailing it in or faxing it or emailing it. It will just be a form that you fill out on the internet, and they will mail you a ballot. And so that's particularly, I think, with younger folks who don't tend to have postage, for example. That's going to be really helpful. The statute says that the state board doesn't have to take that system live until September 1st. I put a request out to them today asking if they would consider making it live earlier and what their timeline is generally for that system going online. I think it will be more helpful to voters and to the local boards if that system is live sooner rather than later. But stay tuned about that. And then the bill also allocates some additional federal money that came down as part of the CARES Act to the county boards that will be helpful to them to deal with the additional budget needs. And then requires the Department of Health and Human Services and the state board to develop some guidelines for the multi-partisan assistance teams that traditionally have gone into congregate care facilities, so nursing homes, hospitals, et cetera, to assist with voting. Obviously, in a stance where nursing homes are closed to the general public, as they have been for the past several months, that makes that much harder. So they gave DHHS and the state board some flexibility to figure out a system that works better. And I think that will be very helpful for the residents of those facilities. So those were all the COVID related things. And now I want to talk a little bit about just the sort of common issues that exist in any election, and that I encourage you to keep an eye out for and to be thinking about and to be an advocate for voters on. The first, and these are sort of chronological, is the early voting plans. And those are being adopted right now by the county boards. I know there has been some talk about trying to get an early voting site at the college in Davidson, and I would be very grateful if that happened. And I know that some of you are working on that. And then the insufficient judges and poll workers. Another good thing that House Bill 1169 did is that it eliminated the requirement that judges be in precinct for this election cycle, and only requires that they be folks who live in that county. And that additional flexibility is going to be really valuable. And then this backlog that we expect of mail-in ballot requests and mail-in ballot returns, that's going to be a real challenge for local boards, and they're going to have to staff up to deal with it. And then there's the voter information and voter suppression that people misinformation and voter suppression that people typically think of being associated with voter protection. So that's things like intimidating mail or robocalls, or things that just have misleading information that are disseminated to voters. In an age of fake news and social media, that stuff is more rampant than ever before and harder to trace than ever before. And so we try to track it where we find it and get rid of it where we can, or at least contact voters who we think have been affected by misinformation, to ensure that they know their rights and they know the rules around voting. And then, threats made towards certain communities, and that can look like anonymous pamphlets in Black neighborhoods about any number of things that might suppress voters there. And it can also look like things like sheriffs speaking to immigrant communities and or speaking to people who are former felons in a way, or providing them with information in a way that suggests they don't have the right to vote. And we've seen that. I don't obviously think you will see that in Mecklenburg County this year, but we see it in some of our more rural counties occasionally. Or things like sheriffs posting up sheriff's deputies outside of polling places in minority precincts during early voting and election day, that we try to put a stop to. And then during early voting and on election day, when you have 2,700 precincts and millions of people voting, anything can go wrong. And a lot of these issues are administrative. A lot of it is because of lack of resources, but things like broken machines, not having enough ballots, long lines, things that prevent handy, accessible parking or access to the voting facility. And then, of course, the problems of voter intimidation that are really bad, things like malfeasance or misconduct by the judges or other officials in a polling place, challenges by Republican poll observers of people's right to vote, intimidation or improper electioneering outside of the polling place. And then something that we have seen in Mecklenburg County many times before is parking problems at polling places that are just busy polling places and don't have adequate parking for the number of voters who want to be there in peak hours. So any number of those issues that we try to resolve come up pretty often. Speak a little bit about poll observers, and sometimes, a question I often get is, what is the difference between poll workers, poll observers, and inside observers and outside observers and poll greeters and all of those things? Those are different terms for different people, and it can get a little confusing. So your poll workers are the folks who work for the Board of Elections, administering the election in a nonpartisan fashion. Your poll greeters are the folks who stand outside with pamphlets and blue ballots and try to cajole voters and convince them to vote for their candidates at the last minute, or just smile and try to be a happy face. And then your observers, and there are sort of two categories of observers, are the people who are actually trying to engage in voter protection and making sure that everybody can vote. So you can have outside poll observers, and these may be party observers. They may be some of our volunteers, or they may be with a nonpartisan organization like Democracy NC or others. And these are people who try to keep people in lines if the lines are long, provide people with a voter assistance hotline number if they have a question or were denied the right to vote, keep an eye on the curbside voting line to make sure that is being properly manned, and generally assist voters who are having voting issues at that precinct. The outside observers can also, and we encourage them to call into our county volunteers and to the statewide boiler room if they have issues that they feel that need to be elevated to the county board or to the state board, or need a legal eye to them. And then the in-precinct observers and the at-large observers, these are appointed by the county party chairs. I've been working with your county party chair, Jane, and county party chairs in every county to recruit volunteers for these positions. But these are folks who are in the polling place, observing the election process, and ensuring that the officials are doing everything properly, ensuring that voters who have issues have the right to vote. And the observers communicate with the chief judge any problems they may be having. Of course, if the chief judge is not fixing those problems, they communicate them to the county lead or to the boiler room to have them elevated and addressed higher up the chain. And then, they just report issues like broken machines and consistent errors and things that might prevent people from being able to vote or make it harder to vote in that polling place during early voting or on election day. So that's what the observers do. So some key takeaways before I get to the questions. There is an organized effort by Republicans nationally to disenfranchise people, to intimidate people, and to misinform voters. That has been made worse by COVID-19, and indeed we have seen them try to take advantage of it in many states. North Carolina is one of their top targets because we are the battleground state. We have a competitive presidential race, a competitive governor's race, a competitive Senate race, statewide control of the judiciary, statewide control of the legislature, every council of state. We have a very long ballot this year, and the choices that are made on that ballot this year are going to define policy in North Carolina for a long time to come. So the Republicans know that, and we know that, and they will do anything they can to win here in North Carolina. But so will we. Of course, the pandemic has changed everything. It has shifted the paradigm in all parts of our lives, and voting is no exception. We are glad that House Bill 1169 has passed and that it takes some of the steps we need to take to make voting easier, but there's still going to be a lot of challenges, and we all have to be mindful of those challenges and step up to try to address them. And of course, organization and communication is key. Organizing at the precinct level on up to protect the vote, and communicating problems in a way that I can deal with them, and that the other attorneys who volunteer for our program can deal with them in a rapid manner is really the only way that we can ensure that the people who are affected by challenges, the challenges at the polls, can vote. Because if we find out about something after 30 people have left the polling place, it's going to be hard to track those 30 folks down. And so, organizing, having eyes and ears on the ground, and communicating throughout the voter protection infrastructure is really important, both in the lead up to and on election day. And then successful voter protection begins now. And I put those words on this slide back in February. Voter protection begins at the county board meetings in off years when they're trying to consolidate precincts. Voter protection happens all year round, every year. But it's about talking to your county board of elections members and the director and other staff there about what they need and what they plan to do to make the election work. It's about advocating for voters in your community, whether it's what they select as a voting site or whether you get an early voting site. It's about advocating for the folks where you are and where you know best. And then, of course, it's about building out a volunteer team to register voters, to help people absentee vote, to observe the voting process, and to protect the vote in Precinct 206. So with that, I'm glad to take your questions. I'm going to pop out of my screen share so that I can see everyone again. So just 1 second.
Okay.